Today, I'm showcasing how I like to use local adjustments in both Adobe Lightroom and ON1 Photo RAW. Hey everyone, it's Hudson. Welcome to this week's Approaching the Scene. I want to thank everybody out there who's been participating in the office hours that I'm holding during the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as everyone who's been liking, sharing, subscribing to the channel. It makes a huge, huge difference. This particular video kind of springs out of the office hours that I held this week with my good buddy Rick LePage, where we went through people's submitted images that they've taken during the pandemic, and we talked about everyone's image that submitted them. Went through kind of some of our own images and did a big Q&A. And one of the things in the Q&A, we were talking about how maybe in some images there were global adjustments to the image that should have only been applied to a localized part of the image, maybe localized adjustments versus global adjustments. And there were a couple people that asked the question, well, where can I learn more about local adjustments? And since this Approaching the Scene video series is all driven by what everyone in the viewing audience wants to hear, I thought I'd talk a little bit about how I use my favorite way of using local adjustments in two of my the two editing platforms that I use the very most, Adobe Lightroom and ON1 Photo RAW. So I'm gonna jump in. I've been going through some images that I've not gotten the time to fully edit over the past year and a half of my busy workshop schedule and everything else running along in life. And in going through some of them, I kind of went through. I've got some HDR images. But there's this one image from the Tetons. It's the Mormon barn out there, and I'm going to bring it up in develop here. I'm going to just hit the D key, which is jumping me in here in develop. I was in the grid view in library a second ago. I'm going to go in here and develop. I'm going to close the bottom pane, get as big a view of this image as we can, and you can see it's that colorful moment. There was some really beautiful cloud, but there's no direct light on the foreground. So there's kind of a big difference between my foreground and my background here. And I just want to differentially edit the sky from the foreground here. And I'm going to go in, I'm actually going to turn off the information here. This was captured with my Nikon Z7. There's no need for HDR in this image. I could see right in camera, the whole histogram is captured. There's no highlights blown out on the right side of the histogram, no shadows blocked out. But if I edit the image for the foreground, the sky is going to suffer, and if I edit the image for the sky, the foreground is going to suffer. So I'm just going to show you a quick way that I like to work with that in Lightroom. And I'm just going to jump in here, and I'm really going to adjust this image looking at the foreground. I'm going to go ahead, I'm holding down the Option key in or you know what I can do? I can just click these two little check boxes. Those little triangles are going to show me, if I blow the highlights all the way out in the scene, you'll see this red mask where we've lost color detail. Obviously, I don't want to do that. But you can see I'm really looking at the foreground. I'm not worried about the fact that I'm really making the sky too dark here. I'm just really I'm editing for the foreground, not the snowy part of the mountain with the light on it, not the clouds. And then I'm going to take shadows down to where we start to just kind of lose a little bit there. You see that black point coming out where we see the blue mask coming on the scene. Red means highlights are blown, blue means completely dark shadows. And I like a little bit of dark shadow in my scene. And then I can go ahead and boost shadows, just get a little more contrast between the darker parts of the scene and the black parts of the scene. Make sure that little corral has some detail in it. I'm really liking the foreground, but the sky just looks terrible, right? This whole part of the histogram over here is just way too bright. Well, what I'm going to do is use a local adjustment. And I could either grab a brush and paint the whole sky in. If I grab the brush, I suddenly have all of my kind of developed controls here. Right now, I'd just be adding a half a stop of exposure, and I can brush it into the image. And I have some controls over the size of my brush. The bracket keys on your keyboard, the right bracket makes bigger, the left bracket makes smaller. The feather is this sort of area between the outer circle and inner circle of my brush. I'll move my brush here. You can kind of see that outer circle and inner circle is a zone that softens the effect. So it's all being applied in the inner circle. None of it's being applied outside the outer circle, and that painting is going in softly in between. And the flow is how much of the effect are you applying in one pass through the scene. And auto mask kind of is edge aware, and it tries to keep track of edges. So, but what I love to do in a scene like this where I'm really working with the sky, and in a lot of scenes, is I like to use the graduated filter. A lot like using a graduated filters in the old days of film. I don't use graduated filters in the field anymore because I have this capability. If there's too much of a difference between the highlights in the sky and the shadows in the foreground, I'll capture multiple frames, blend those images into an HDR, and then do this kind of work. But as long as I've got all the data that I want, it's really easy to differentially edit the top part from the bottom part, and even to raw process them. So what I'm going to do is drop this graduated filter in here, and by dragging down, it makes the filter, it's applied above, not below. If I drag up, it would be applied below. And I can kind of move it into the scene. I can grab that central line and rotate it, and I can increase or decrease its feather. So it's being none of it is applied below the bottom line, all of it is applied above the top line. This is like the old days of graduated filters, whether you had a hard stop or soft stop neutral density filter. Was it a rough, hard-edged filter where the top's dark and the bottom's clear and you're holding the sky back with a hard edge, or was it a soft edge? As if I hover over here, you can see how it's applying that effect through. And so what's really cool in Lightroom, and that came along, I don't know, a couple of years ago, is this range mask. It's a basic luminosity masking control. And what we're able to do with it is you can choose to either go by color or by luminance. I'm going to go by luminance, which is tonality. And I want to show the mask that I'm creating. So you can see right now that's the simple gradient mask that I've applied. But when I click on this button and add the luminance range mask, that's basically like a luminosity mask, and I show luminance mask, it gives me a red overlay, I can just say I want to eliminate anything that's shadowy from that particular mask. And we'll talk about the smoothest slider in a second. But I want to go ahead and eliminate anything shadowy. So some of the shadows in the clouds are being, less of the effect is being applied. It's being applied less in the shadows than in the highlights. And as I start pulling that, wherever it's pink, it's being applied. Where it's not pink, where it's grayscale, it's not being applied. And you can see I'm just getting rid of that effect in the darker part of my scene. I'm okay with it being applied to the darker bits of the clouds. And then the smoothness slider is just a basic control over, how hard is that transition? It's like a feather. How is it softly applied into the scene, or is it harshly applied into the scene? And what I'd advocate is leave that in the middle and apply that mask in a way that, that looks about the best. Turn the mask control settings off. And in this case, you want to be moving your controls a bit. I'm going to lower overall exposure a bit. I'm going to pull the whites way back. Remember, we boosted those in the underlying image. I'm going to pull highlights back a little bit. I'm going to pull contrast back a little bit because I don't like a lot of contrast in the sky. I don't want edgy clouds. I can pull my black point down a little bit to just get a little bit more contrast in there. And then what I'll do, I'm probably going to pull exposure back up a little bit. It's more about the highlights and the whites. Yeah, maybe I'll leave exposure. I liked it the way it was. The other thing I can do is I can differentially play around with color toning. Do I want the sky warmer? Do I want it a little cooler? I think just a smidge cooler, a little bit bluer without bluing up the foreground. And then what I'll do is go back down here and I'll pull the smoothness slider and see, at what point does that look the best to me? That, without looking at the red overlay, it's the actual effect on the scene. And I get it to where it's looking, that's too much, obviously, to me. But you're going to get it to that nice natural look that has the effect that you're after. And there we go. One thing I would probably do here too, if I was doing my complete edit here in Lightroom, I might bump the texture up a little bit, which just adds some kind of sharpening and micro contrast. And then in the sky, I don't want that kind of sharpening and micro contrast in my clouds, so I'll just pull it back down. And one of the neat things here is that as we do this back and forth, we can go back and look at the entire image, maybe boost highlights a little bit more, throughout the scene, boost the white point, pull the highlights back just a smidge, looking at the whole scene. We're getting it all balanced now. Pushing the shadows overall up a little bit. So you can kind of get an idea what I'm talking about, localized adjustment. I'm really just pulling the sky back to be in line with the rest of the scene. And that's basically the way I do it in Lightroom. Sometimes if it's not a straight line that's running across your scene like a horizon line, maybe there's just a part of your scene that's a little too bright and you want to do that kind of work, but with some nuance, I would go in with the brush and make those same kinds of adjustments where I get it looking the way that I want, and then you can use that range mask or even the color mask if there's something that's one color that you need to adjust separately from the rest of the image. It's just a way to locally do some work in Lightroom that's a lot more nuanced than how Lightroom used to do this kind of stuff with brush strokes and having that line sort of set. So that's how I work in Lightroom when I'm doing localized adjustments. I don't do a lot of localized adjustments in Lightroom. A lot of times when I go into finish edit an image, I'll do my raw basic processing in Lightroom and my cataloging, and then I'll jump into ON1 to do finish editing. And I think you'll see why when I jump here into ON1. Let's have a look at the same image, and I'll do the whole edit in here because I know there's a lot of people here who are ON1 from start to finish. So let's just do a full raw edit here in ON1. I'm going to jump into the edit part of the app instead of the browse app, and I'm going to go down here. I'm going to go into tone and color, and it's the same exact thing. I'm going to go ahead and I'm holding down the J key instead of the or you can also click these triangles here the same way you can in Lightroom so that you see the clipping mask if you want. I'll zero that guy out. I'm going to pull my whites up just a smidge. I'm watching that red channel on the edge of the histogram though. I don't want to blow that red channel. And then I'm going to pull the blacks back down a bit. Well, you know what? Again, we're gonna differentially adjust this. I forget. So I'm really not going to worry too much about it. I'm really adjusting it for the foreground. I'm going to go ahead and let that sky get brighter than I actually want it. And you can see we've got about the same amount of clipping that we had before. I'm going to go ahead now and bump the shadows up, particularly here in the foreground. I'm looking at that corral. I'm going to turn off my clipping mask now. I don't need it. And then I'm going to pull highlights back a little bit. Looking more at the foreground, less at the background, or at the sky. Midtones is a slider that Lightroom doesn't have. I kind of make big, broad adjustments in it and settle on a spot that looks good to me. I'm boosting them just a little bit here. And I think, let's see, I might warm the scene up just a little bit. Not a lot, just a smidge. And I think this image requires just a little bit of noise reduction, especially since we bumped the shadows up a little bit. It's not too bad. But I think in Lightroom, the Nikon Z cameras that I'm working with tend to do some automatic noise reduction. It's just sort of built in. And ON1, it doesn't apply those. So I'm just going to pull up, I'm looking at the scene at 100%, holding down the Option key to get a black and white mask so color doesn't confuse me. And I'm just bumping the luminance noise reduction up to where I lose. There's a little bit of noise in here in the shadows. And I might pull sharpening up just a little bit, just looking at the scene here. This is an image I really like, might want to print one day, so I'm going to squeeze every bit of sharpness out of here without noise. There we go, that looks better to me. And so we're back to tone and color here. I want to zoom back out. The sky is way too bright. So I'm going to do exactly the same thing. I'm going into local adjustments here. And I have a choice between a brush and a graduated filter. I'm going to drop my graduated filter in. I flip it over. By default, it's kind of, well, you can choose which way you want it. There's whether it's at the top or the bottom. I dropped in one that was masking out the bottom of the frame. And I can click this little button down here to show the mask once again. And one thing I can do, actually, you know what? I didn't even need to drop the graduated filter in here. What I can do instead is I'm here on this adjustment layer, and I'm lowering the exposure just to get a look at what that's doing to the sky. And it's doing some really nice things to the sky. What I can do now that's really, really cool is I'll go in and I'm going to click on that mask icon here on the adjustment layer. And I'm going to click on its luminosity mask. And what you'll see is we've built a luminosity mask where we're masking out the darker parts of it. What's masked out is red, and what's coming through is white. And what I want to go ahead and do, it's got this controls called levels, is I want to mask out more of the dark parts of the frame. As you can see as I pull this, we're masking out the darker part of the frame. I pull this kind of midpoint over, still masking those dark clouds out. I'm masking more. There we go. Coming back a little bit. Oh, that's what I need to do. I want to pull the white, this central slider over a little bit towards white. And the neat thing in here is that what I can do after I've done these adjustments and I'm really keeping the darker part of the frame, this foreground frame, masked out, is I can switch over to a brush, and I'm still on the same layer here, and I'll say I'm going 100% opacity, so I'm going to paint in the upper part of the frame here, these darker clouds. I don't want them involved at all. So all I can do is run my brush through here, and I'm just going to completely remove the mask from this upper level. And if I want to get more detailed about it, I can turn on my perfect brush setting, and that's an edge-aware brush. It's looking at tonality, so it might paint in the snow, but the snow is really bright. I don't mind that happening in my scene at all. I can go in here and really get in and just paint the sky without painting the mountains in. You know, and I would probably zoom into 100% and just use this amazing little tool to get in and get rid of you get the idea. Go in and just really highlight the sky, where all that I'm editing is the sky. I'm just making individual clicks here, and it's just taking out things that are the tone that the center of my brush is over. You can see this is pretty amazingly easy. Boop. Hover over that. Multiple little clicks are a good way to go here, so that you're not, if you make a mistake, you can always undo. You can click the Edit Undo or hit Command Z on the Mac or Control Z on the PC. I'm just running through and taking out that edge. And once I do that, then I can turn off the perfect brush, like so, and just make my brush a little bit bigger and stay off the mountains and paint the rest of it out. Just make sure that we're not having that mask anywhere we don't want it. There, you see that working. All right, boom. I would go in and do a little bit finer detail on that. I could easily take this little brush down and get rid of some of these bits. You get the idea. Pretty simply done. And the nice thing is I can copy that mask and apply it all through ON1 to other layers that I'm working on, more adjustment layers, whatever I want to do. So I go ahead, click this, it closes that whole control setting. And now I can go in and do a lot of the same things. We'll go ahead and turn off our mask view here so we're not looking at it. And I'll go in and drop our highlights down, drop our whites down significantly. Go ahead and I can pull shadows back some just in the sky and in the snowfields. Midtones again, now we're just working on the sky but not the foreground barn. And we've got things pretty evenly processed at this point. Now, one cool thing with ON1, I really like their presets. So I've got these presets I've made for myself that are common things that I do editing images in their effects module. You look at ON1, you've got develop, effects, portrait stuff, and local adjustments. Right now we're in local adjustments. All of this is raw processing. So I could run back here. It's just writing metadata instructions for how to handle the file. And I could go in and underlying those local adjustments are our original developing adjustments. So if I want to pull whites back a little bit more and globally boost shadows a touch. All that stuff is propagating up through that local adjustment layer that we made with the mask. And now I could jump in and, this was a fall scene. Fall colors abound in here. It's kind of warm tones. So I'm going to go in here to my presets that I've created, common editing things I do, finish editing in ON1, which is always I do in effects. And I'm going to go ahead and hit their quick view browser, which gives me a big look at all of these particular effects that I've created in here. And as I roll through, I'm kind of liking gold reflections. First snow looks nice. I think maybe first snow actually fits really well here. So I'll go ahead and click that. It's going to apply a whole bunch of effects in the effects panel here. And I always view this as kind of a starting point. It also is a good showcase of things that you can do. Whenever you want to apply a filter, there's this whole list of filters that you can add to your image and then adjust. And each one has a myriad of settings. It's basically layers like you would have in Photoshop. And each one has its own mask, and each one has its own blending tools like you would have in Photoshop. It gets very, very deep, or it's very simple to use. It just, it's kind of intuitive and easy to work with. You can see I could even paste that mask that we created earlier into this if I wanted to reuse it. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to reset the mask here. But the thing I love about editing in here is it's so easy to do local adjustments because you can mask each layer, and we're still raw processing here. Nothing's been baked in. So you can see that the preset I made just added a little bit of contrast and a little bit of something called compression, which is kind of an HDR look filter. Close that. Dynamic contrast is a kind of an amazing filter that adds local contrast and sharpening that really makes an image pop. Look at the barn and the fence and the way that that makes it pop. If we zoom in here and have a look at 100% at this scene, there it goes to full res. You can see that we're getting this nice little pop. If I turn it off, especially when you go to print, that really stands out, the vegetation in the foreground. What I don't like is dynamic contrast applied in the sky. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to paste that filter in, which does the opposite of what I want. It's getting the dynamic contrast off the foreground, and I'm just going to invert it, and that'll take it right out of the sky. Boom. There you can see. We've just eliminated any dynamic contrast from being applied to the clouds. The color enhancing filter. Color enhancing filter has crazy individualized controls for hue, saturation, and brightness for every different bit of the color channel here. So, if I want to take the yellows in this scene and move them a bit more towards orange, I just pull that hue slider a bit. Saturation bumps that up. You get the idea. And so, for example, blues, we could take blues and just pull the brightness down a little bit and darken the sky a touch. You get the idea. It's powerful, powerful stuff. There's a second color enhancer filter running in here. I was apparently working on multiple colors in here. And in this one, I might actually tone it back just a little bit. The opacity slider will just blend that globally into the image and out. I think that looks really nice though. And then finally, there's a vignette in here, and because it's a preset, it's not applied specifically for this image. So what I do is, I turn the feather down to get a look at this vignette. I'll probably make it a little darker to easily see what's going on. I'm going to change its roundness, make it more rounded, change its size down to much smaller, grab the centering tool, pull it down here over the farm, over the barn, maybe make it a little bit bigger. And then I'm going to take the feather back up to 100%, and I'm going to make it far less of an effect. I'm just going to back off that effect so that your eye's drawn more to the barn and not the background scene. And so you can see there's a little bit of lens corrections going on, automated lens corrections going on here in ON1 too, but boom, there's the Tetons. All right, so those are my favorite ways to use local adjustments in my two favorite editing platforms. This whole discussion grew out of a question from my office hours this week. My office hours are a thing I'm doing during the coronavirus pandemic where a lot of us have more time around home, and every Tuesday morning at 10 a.m., I'm having just a little group video get together with Q&A and topics. This next week we're going to talk about some of the differences moving from mirrorless to moving from DSLR to mirrorless, and some of the things that are great and some of the things that still are wonderful about DSLRs. I'm going to try to see if my good buddy David Archer can join me for that, given that he's still mostly shooting with DSLRs and I'm mostly embraced mirrorless. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions about the Nikon Z cameras, but feel free if you're a Sony or any other brand shooter. I've shot with Sony and Panasonic and Fuji, and basically there aren't too many cameras I haven't used, and I think everybody's making amazing cameras these days. So we'll talk about some of the benefits, some of the drawbacks, some of the reasons to think about changing up or staying with what you love, and take a lot of questions and answers in the whole process. So again, you just go to my website, www.hudsonhenry.com/office hours. And you know, for everyone who's an essential worker, thoughts are with you. Hope that you're being safe out there and your families and you are safe. Anybody in the medical community, thanks so much for all that you're doing through this crisis in the world. And I hope that everyone like me who's stuck at home more than they're used to is finding the time with family rewarding, the ability to reconnect with friends, even if it's just over video chatting, and maybe catching up on some projects. I've been going through images I've been meaning to edit forever, and doing projects around the studio, and cleaning out my garage, and planting a garden. And so it's not all terrible. I hope everyone is safe and all their loved ones are safe. And you know, I hope you'll join up with me for office hours this next week, Tuesday at 10 a.m. The link is in the video description. And thanks so much for subscribing to the channel, liking the videos, sharing them with your friends. It makes a big difference. If you haven't subscribed yet, there's a little button to click to subscribe in the bottom right corner. It's a little double H logo. Thanks so much. We'll see you next week.